Hey guys, I apologize in advance for the length of this video. I know it's very, very long, but the reason for that is I didn't think it was worth just doing a small, hey, this is a new product type video, when there's actually a lot of information about I-type flash adapters that just isn't really well known in the general public. They've sort of been around and you see people mention them on various forums across the internet, but no one really dives deep into how they work or really covers some of the drawbacks or caveats to using them. I think quite often they're shown as this like mysterious, elusive product that is very misunderstood, and I wanted to cover some of the pros and cons, some of the design quirks, all about how they function and what it means to use one. As always, in my longer videos, I'm going to leave timestamps down below in the video description for those that want to skip around. So yeah, I know this is long, but you guys know me by now. I'm literally incapable of making short-term content because there's just so much stuff to cover, and so I'd like you guys to dive in. For those that don't want to watch, listen to it as if it was a podcast. I'm sure you'll take a lot out of it. Hello everyone, the Instant Camera Guy here, and welcome to what will be yet another video on a SX-70 I-type adapter. Today I wanted to talk to you about the new Power Mix by PolaStudio. Now, some of you might be looking at this adapter getting some deja vu. Last year I released a very long video titled The Ultimate Guide to I-type Adapters, where I featured, among many other adapters, the Power Bar by Chromatic Parts. I have one here. In that video, I claimed that Dennis from Chromatic Parts had effectively invented the method of powering an SX-70 through the flash socket, right, by plugging it in like so. And it was a solution that I said in the video was particularly novel. Now, that statement is actually somewhat incorrect, and I want to make an addendum. See, Dennis released the Power Bar around August 2022. Now, I've been digging around since then, and it seems that this concept actually dates back over a year prior to that, being invented by a guy called Nuno Cruz, who actually posted a video about it to YouTube back in March of 2021. So pretty much a year and 3 months or so earlier. Now, this is actually the earliest example of such a power method that I've been able to find. However, if you can find earlier examples of them, I would love for you to post like links or I guess citations below in the comments, because I think it's a very interesting subject. I was unaware of anything like this prior to the Power Bar, so if anyone had been working on a solution earlier than that, I would love to know about it so that I can credit them. So it would seem then that based on Nuno's video, whether people followed that and took that as inspiration or not, it does seem that after that video was released, that a few others in Europe then independently came up with similar designs of their own throughout 2022. Now, Dennis did have a novel way of coupling the power source from the Power Bar into like the power of the camera within the socket on Model 1 and Model 2 cameras, which I'll go into more detail briefly later in the video, but I just wanted to correct my previous video and say that, yeah, Dennis appears that he wasn't alone in terms of coming up with this idea. Now, the Power Bar, as far as I'm aware, is no longer actually available as a product, and my understanding is that Chromatic Parts is currently on hiatus for personal reasons. Why that is the case, we don't know. I've heard from some clients that he has shut up business, and I've heard from other clients that he is still open, but with a wait list of around 6 months to have a camera serviced, so I really don't know what's going on. Dennis, if you are watching, feel free to leave a comment below and let everyone know what you're up to. But it does seem that Johnny from Polar Studios has come in to fill the gap left behind in absence of the Power Bar being a product. So in today's video, I want to go through all the features of this new product. I want to talk about some of the things that I really like about it. I want to talk about some of the things that I don't like about it so much. And I want to talk about the kind of use case that this specific adapter suits. Because of the similarities in this product to the previous Power Bar, A lot of my opinions on it are going to be pretty similar to the last video that I did, but because this is going to be a standalone video, I do want to dive into things in quite a bit more depth and go into a lot of explanation about how these actually work and how it's possible to route power through the flash socket into an SX-70. And I want to really talk about the pros and cons that you get out of doing that, because although it is a novel solution for powering the camera, there are several drawbacks which I do feel need to be mentioned. And I'm going to talk about, how the adapter works in quite a lot of depth, because I believe that information is important to know. If that kind of thing doesn't really interest you, of course, you can skip ahead in the video. I will put timestamps in the video description down below, but I encourage you to actually pay attention, because you might learn something about how, these unique cameras work. Now, before I dive into this video, I want to just briefly cover two potential conflicts of interest here. I bring it up because I try and be quite transparent about things on this channel, and I'm always being sure to mention pros and cons about everything that I review. But you must be aware that as a repairman, I tend to prioritize things like practicality and repairability and usability over things like aesthetics. Now, the first thing I want to mention specifically is that Johnny from PolaStudios and I do know each other professionally. I often have a lot of my clients buy products from him and have them shipped directly to me to cut out a middleman. Anyone watching from the USA, that's probably going to be a good idea going forwards if Chinese tariffs continue to affect Johnny's company. But here you can see an SX-70 that I recently finished refurbishing for a client, and the client sent to me the green sonar housing, green leather, and green shutter button, all from PolaStudios. So this is not the first time I've dealt with PolaStudios. We chat every now and again, and we do know each other personally. I did not pay a cent for this adapter. He actually sent it alongside some other things that I purchased from him on the condition that I could try it out and do a review of it. Now, I feel this is important to mention, as many YouTubers neglect to mention this when they are magically gifted fancy items before an official launch of a product. Now, if you are one of those YouTubers and you're watching, you know who you are. Be better. Secondly, I want to mention that, well, I have my own I-type battery solution that I've dubbed the PolaVolt. It is, as you've probably seen if you're a regular on this channel, a very compact lithium-ion battery solution that is integrated into the camera's original electronics that sits at the rear of the camera. Now, you'll note that I call my PolaVolt an I-type solution instead of an I-type product. And that's because, well, it's not really a product per se. And it was for that reason that when I released my ultimate guide to I-type adapter video, I put my PolaVolt all the way at the end of the video for that very reason. Now, the truth is, I think that this is an excellent solution, especially for the price, and I think that it has numerous advantages over the commercial adapters that are available. And in many ways, it is better than this. In some ways, this is better than the PolaVolt. I'll launch into that a little later in the video. But the truth is that, well, this is much more involved to install. It's not really something you add to the camera, it's something that you install while you're servicing the camera. So, as a result, I would say that the PolaVolt is likely beyond the scope of the average Joe to install. And so, as a result of that, it is a service that I offer to clients commercially. I offer it as an upgrade when I'm already overhauling their camera. It just makes sense that I add it while I'm already inside the thing, and obviously I benefit financially from the PolaVolt solution. However, I would also like to point out that I did make the PolaVolt project an open source solution, and I have publicly listed videos here on YouTube about how to wire one in yourself should you possess the skills and parts. So, although I do charge for this, it is also something that I give away for free. I figured that I would just get that out of the way, lest someone accuse me of being a shill in either case. Now, just a brief reminder as to why you might want to I-type adapt a camera. I-type film and 600 film are basically the same. In my left hand, I have a pack of 600 film. In my right hand, I have I-type film. The only difference is the batteries. In 600 film, as you can see here with these two little battery terminals, the battery is actually built into the pack of film. In I-type film, there is no battery, and thus the camera has to be powered externally from some other kind of power source. SX-70 cameras never came out with such a power source, and so you must come up with some kind of adapter in order to modify them. In terms of the cameras themselves, any kind of SX-70 will also need to be modified to take 640 ISO film. Current SX-70 film is 160 ISO, and 640 ISO film is 4 times faster. So it's not simply enough that you have to add a power supply to the camera. If you want the camera to also expose correctly for the new film, you also need to modify the camera's shutter. Now, this can be done either by swapping a resistor or a capacitor, depending on the specifics of the board, assuming that the original board is in good functional condition, or you can install a new PCB, such as the SX-70R PCB, that allows you to shoot 600 film by default. Alternatively, you can use filter material, such as this ND filter here. You know, if you put ND filter material over the lens, it'll reduce the light coming in and thus compensate, allowing you to put 600 film in the camera. You can also put this same material over the pack of film itself, reducing the light that gets to the film. However, in my opinion, this just really isn't worth it, because you lose the main benefit to 600 film, which is that it's 4 times faster in terms of its ISO. That means you get 4 times better performance in low light scenarios, you get an effective shutter speed that is 4 times faster, and an effective aperture that is much smaller. The result of that is generally much sharper photos, depending on the environment that you're shooting in. And that's one of the reasons that the SLR-680, which is a folding SLR that takes 600 film natively, is so highly coveted. Many people think that the SLR-680, of which I have a sample over here that I've just been finishing up for a client, a lot of people think that the SLR-680 is an amazing camera that somehow produces sharper photos than the SX-70. That has nothing to do with the shutter or lens or anything like that. In fact, it uses the same lens as a standard SX-70. The reason that people think that these are better, not just because of the built-in flash, is simply because they're designed to take 600 film natively. And that means smaller aperture, faster shutter speed, and thus generally much sharper photos for a given environment compared to what an SX-70 would be able to do. So unfortunately, although the 680 is native for 600 film, it can't be powered by one of these, you know, flash socket I-type adapters because, well, it lacks a flash socket. So that's what I'm trying to get at here is, in order to use one of these bars, you can't really use a stock camera. The camera has to be 600 modified unless you want to faff around with using filters for the rest of your life. The other thing that I would recommend doing is, if you're going to use this in a quote-unquote stock SX-70, is to actually have the camera refurbished and remove the original metal tongue that sits here inside the body of the camera. All SX-70s have this little tongue inside. You guys can probably just see it where I'm touching here. Basically what that tongue is designed to do was, you know, when Polaroid invented the SX-70, they had the foresight to think that, well, we're probably going to introduce different formats of film of different ISOs. We should invent some kind of mechanism that, you know, ensures that people only use the right film. And basically I-type film has like a little plastic lug at the end, which will hit the tongue inside and prevent you from inserting the pack. And that means that if you want to use I-type film, you will generally have to use side cutters to snip that lug off, and do that for every single pack. Or when you have a camera refurbished, and this is what I do for my clients, I always remove those tongues so that it's not an issue in the future. I'll touch more on that a little later in the video, but I wanted to just remind you guys why people might want an I-type adapter in the first place. And the last reason is, of course, I-type film is much cheaper than 600 film. For a 5-pack, you basically get, if you compare purchasing a 5-pack of 600 film versus a 5-pack of I-type film, you're basically getting a pack for free when you purchase I-type film. Here in Australia, it's roughly $120 for 600 versus $150. $150 for 600 film versus roughly $120 for I-type film. So there is a big savings, which if you shoot a lot of film, will add up over time. So let's talk a little bit about how this thing works. Here I have an SX-70 sonar. This thing is completely unrestored. It is in original condition. I've just removed the leatherette in preparation for restoring it. And here I have the PolaStudio Power Mix. The way that the mix works is by injecting voltage through the flash socket, through the PCB, down into the body of the camera, and into the rest of the electronics. It effectively works the reverse way of how the camera would normally function, which is using batteries built into the pack of film that you then insert into the camera, which then goes on to spread voltage through the body, going to the main drive motor, and then coming up through this little ribbon cable on the side of the shutter housing here, which then powers the main electronics in the shutter PCB, and in the SX-70 sonar, the autofocus motor, in addition to all the solenoids that control the shutter. Now, what the mix is doing in the case of the SX-70 sonar is actually tapping in to some extra terminals that are found in the flash socket. So an SX-70 flash socket will generally have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 little terminals at the front, which go on to communicate with where the original flash bar would have gone. Effectively what those terminals do, the first two, when you're looking at the front of the camera, the first two are a switch, so that when you insert a flash, it basically tells the PCB, hey, a flash has been inserted. And what the rest of those terminals do is basically send voltage into the actual flash socket. There we go. This camera does need to be refurbished, but and then a little chip called the flash fire assembly will send voltage. This one clearly needs a clean, but basically sends voltage into one of wherever the 5 flash bulbs are. Now, that's the front, right? But a sonar, you might notice, is a slightly different shaped socket, and that's because there are 4 extra terminals at the back. Now, if we hold the camera, viewing it from behind, and we look at those 4 terminals, they are trigger, focus, plus 6 volts, and park. So effectively, they correspond to the park sensor for focusing, and then for firing the shutter, or triggering the shutter. And if you get a piece of wire, let's see if I have something here. Right, if you get a piece of wire, and you take that 6-volt signal, and then you bridge the other things, right? I should say I actually got that wrong. It is focus, trigger, 6-volt, park. But you can see if you take that 6-volt signal and then you bridge it onto the other 2 connectors, you guys can hear that motor, and then you can actually use that signal to control the cameras. Now, what the mix does is basically takes that 6-volt line, takes the ground from the switch that tells the flash that's engaged and controls the solenoid, and basically what that does is it uses that to supply positive and negative to the camera instead. So voltage basically goes down from this little pin at the rear of the bar through that 6-volt signal, and the voltage effectively travels in reverse. It goes through the PCB first, down the ribbon cable, into the body of the camera. Now, what that allows you to do is, quote unquote, use the camera without modification, which is sort of half true. It effectively enables you to power the camera without any kind of external mods. I'll go into that in a bit more depth in just a minute, but that's the whole idea of these adapters. Now, PolaStudio advertises that these can be used for SX-70 sonars as well as SX-70 alphas. And the difference is whether or not that extra little pin on the PCB, the one that connects to the rear terminal on the sonar, is installed or not. You can desolder this pin, and then you'll be able to plug it into a standard alpha type camera, right? And it will work with an alpha camera. Effectively, what it does in that case is it injects voltage where the flash is going to fire from, and then through ground, and delivers voltage that way. Now, that is possible on an SX-70 alpha PCB. I've done videos on this on my channel, but not all original classic-looking SX-70s are the same. The original Model 1 and Model 2 had what they call a 4-pin solenoid design, whereas the Alpha has a 2-pin solenoid design. That's really the easiest way that you can tell the two apart, unless you look at the model numbers and things, is if there's 2 pads for the solenoid, well, you've got an Alpha PCB. If you've got 4 pads, you've got a Model 1 or a Model 2 PCB. The other way that these are different, in addition to the solenoid working differently, is the flash works differently on an Alpha. And without trying to complicate things too much, basically what that means is the mix will happily be able to supply power to an Alpha shutter. But if you try use it on a Model 1 or a Model 2, the voltage that gets chucked through the flash circuitry will fry the flash circuitry. And basically what that means is the chip that controls the voltage that would normally go and trigger the flash, that chip will get destroyed. So if you have a Model 1 or a Model 2 or even a Model 3, the mix will kill your ability to ever use flash ever again. The only way to repair it will be to replace that chip. It will fry things. The only way that this is safe is with an SX-70 alpha. Now, Johnny does make this particularly clear on his website. He does list this in the product description, and by default, I believe that these are set up for sonar cameras, and I do believe that Johnny will be personally vetting everyone that does go to buy a mix to make sure that they are using it only with an alpha spec camera. But I can see that being a problem for Johnny, and something that you'll need to actually manually go and take the screws off of the shutter assembly to check, because it's actually pretty common for technicians. We've all done it. I've done it personally. It's pretty common for us to have an SX-70 alpha come our way with a broken shutter. That's the PCB's dead or something about it is completely fried and we need to swap the shutter. And we might only have a Model 1 or a Model 2 in stock, right? Now remember that they function basically the same. They take the same exposure, same lens. The only thing that's different is how the solenoid works and how the flash is triggered, right? Otherwise, they function exactly the same. So it's pretty common for technicians to have a broken alpha and swap the shutter from a Model 1 or a Model 2. Like I said, us techs, we do it all the time. It doesn't bother us, right? Because it's usually not a problem for the client. However, if you buy this and use it on your SX-70 alpha, and unbeknownst to you, you don't actually have a true SX-70 alpha shutter, well, you're in for a bad time. You will fry your flash. And I wanted to discuss that because I think that's very, very important to know. There's obviously no risk of that happening in a sonar camera because it simply won't happen. But when you buy the alpha version of this, you absolutely must make sure that you have an alpha PCB, and the only way to know for sure is to flip the shutter down and check the type of solenoid that you have. You can kind of do that from the front by taking the front housing off and double checking and making sure that your solenoid only has 2 pins instead of 4. But yeah, you want to absolutely make sure that you are truly putting this in an alpha with a 2-pin solenoid design. Otherwise, you're going to have a very bad time. Now, this very problem between the two types of flash fire assembly is actually something that Dennis had to take into consideration when he made his power bar. And as I explained in the last video, Dennis had a novel solution around that, which us technicians just assumed was impossible. And that basically involved taking the shutter, drilling a hole into the flash fire assembly, adding an additional pogo pin from the rear, JB welding it in place, and then running a wire which would then connect to the PCB's 6-volt rail. Certainly an effective solution, but as a technician, I will also say that it is a huge pain in the ass to install. Very, very tedious to do. It takes a lot of very fine motor skill. It takes JB weld to cure. I could do it, and Dennis entrusted me with the skill of doing it for clients if anyone here in Australia wanted to buy one of his power bars back when he was producing them. But it was not a job that I enjoyed doing. It was very fiddly, but that's how Dennis was able to sell his power bar without that being a problem. As I said, Johnny's mix will work on an alpha, but if you put it into a Model 1 or a Model 2, those earlier style PCBs, you will fry the flash. It will cease to work if you do that. It'll short circuit things and blow things up, and you're going to have a bad day because a flash fire assembly is very tedious to replace. It's actually easier to swap the entire shutter. So if you had a Model 1 or a Model 2 and you absolutely had to have this bar, you would need to get someone to swap out the shutter with one from an SX-70 Alpha, which is kind of going to just defeat the entire purpose of owning the camera, if you ask me. So let's talk about the adapter itself. To date, as far as I am aware, this is certainly the most advanced in terms of flash socket I-type adapters. Throughout this video, I'm going to make a lot of comparisons to the Chromatic Parts power bar, which, as I said before, is currently no longer in production, at least as of me posting this video. And I'm going to make a lot of comparisons because the two products are easily the most similar in terms of the options that have been released to the public. The first thing is let's go over the features, right? And then I'll talk about things like construction. Obviously, it features the little PCB that sits into the flash socket on an SX-70 sonar camera. It's got 2 switches at the top, one to turn the device on. You have some power LED lights that show you how much charge the battery has. And then on the other side, you have a button labeled flash. And what I believe that button does is effectively turn on the studio strobe mode. So the bar has a pass-through socket that allows you to insert a flash, such as the Mint flash bar. But it also has a socket on the side, like a mono audio socket, that then allows you to hook up studio strobe. So you could still use flash while using the bar, either through studio strobe or through installing, say, a Mint flash bar, and still retain flash functionality. Obviously, one of the problems with injecting power through the flash socket is, well, what do you do if you want to use flash? And PolaStudio has considered that. Johnny has baked that into the design. He's actually got a perfectly sized socket. I don't know where he's tracked one of these down. This does look like an off-the-shelf component. But yeah, that perfectly fits a flash bar. And so this does allow you to use a flash with the camera, which I'll demonstrate now. Now, there is quite an order of operations to doing this if you're doing it with an SX-70 that has a standard PCB. You must have film inside the camera, otherwise the electronics will go a little haywire. You'll note that the solenoid is staying closed, and that's because the camera expects film to be in the camera for all the electronics to work properly. So you have to have film in the camera You then have to insert the bar. You have to make sure it's turned on, because once you put a flash on, you can no longer access the power button. And then you can install the flash. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I think that looks frickin' ridiculous. It's not exactly the most stable. It's not exactly the most stable thing I've ever seen. Like, it's pretty floppy. And I think that this would be, like, this is not a setup that you would want to leave on the camera all the time, if you know what I'm saying. Like, this is something that you'd probably want to do for 1 or 2 photos, and then you'd want to take the flash off, because the extra weight puts a lot of extra stress and pressure on both the socket, on the flash adapter, and on the camera. So I wouldn't leave that hooked up for too long just because of the extra weight pushing on all those sockets. It's probably not good for the plastic and the solder joints. But it is certainly something that is possible to do, even if it does become a bit of a wobbly tower of power, so to speak. One other thing that adding the flash so high up on the camera is going to do is it's going to start to interfere with your macro photos, because the flash is going to be much higher. One of the things that flash bars tend to cause problems with is the SX-70 can focus so gosh darn close, it goes all the way down to 10 inches. The higher the lens on the flash sits, the less light is actually going to be on the subject. So I would say that probably if you're stacking the flash on top of the bar, you're probably going to be limited to like portraits from probably a meter away. If you start getting close down to like 10 inches, I think the flash is going to go directly over the top of your subject, and you'll likely end up with a very ombre look to your photos where half the subject is kind of illuminated and the rest is in shadows. So it's certainly possible to use the flash. It's just not something that I would want to rely on all the time. In terms of the actual bar itself, it is made of a very high-grade construction. It feels nice and solid. The outer finish is made of a 3D printed material, which sometimes can be hit or miss depending on the product, but I must say that the finish that Johnny has chosen feels nice and hard. It feels very premium. It's not quite as good as, say, injection molded ABS plastic, but I can understand why he chose this as a material. Chatting to Johnny, this is going to end up being a very niche product from the sound of things, with, you know, not exactly the biggest user base, and so it's just not economically feasible to produce these things with injection molded plastic panels. Personally, I don't think that's such a big issue. Johnny does offer this in a range of different finishes, from translucent resins through to white and black filament, and I think honestly it's strong enough. One thing that I like about Johnny's solution over the classic power bar from Chromatic Parts is that it's much easier to take this thing apart. One of my big criticisms of the power bar was that it was held together with JB Weld. Effectively, although I did like the magnet battery door design, all of the battery terminals and the two 3D printed halves of Dennis's power bar were held in place purely with JB Weld. Now, that makes potentially repairing this thing, if it ever broke, incredibly difficult, if not impossible, whereas Johnny's adapter is held in place with screws, accessible from the rear of the bar. Now, I'm only holding this together at the moment with 2 of those screws, because I want to be able to take it apart and show you guys what's inside. But effectively it's held together with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or so screws, so not exactly the most difficult thing. It just takes a very small Phillips head screwdriver to get inside. And then we have access to the lovely purple PCB with its 2 switches and battery holder. And I love the fact that Johnny has opted a user replaceable battery here. There is no lithium ion pouch cell that, you know, is going to be hard to track down. It takes a very standard CR14500. So this is basically the AA version of or AA sized version, I should say, of a hard cell lithium ion battery, and that means that Johnny has been able to use an off-the-shelf battery holder in the construction of the PCB. likely saving a lot of headache and cost, but most importantly, making the battery very easy for the user to replace. These things are a 3.7 volt lithium-ion battery that is the exact same size and dimension as a regular AA. It is not the same voltage though, nor the same chemistry. If you use a standard AA in here, it's simply just not going to work. The thing won't turn on and it won't have nearly enough power to power the camera. And if you try to charge a regular alkaline AA, it's probably going to blow up. So do be careful that although this looks like a AA, it isn't a regular AA. It is a lithium-ion dressed up as a AA. But either way, to install it, it's as simple as just making sure that you get the polarity correct, and then you put the two halves together. Now, once the two halves are together, you can simply charge the thing using a USB-C cable. So if I unplug my camera here and plug this in, it should charge the battery. So very cool stuff, and I love to see it. Because, you know, having a user replaceable battery is not something that a lot of modern I-type cameras or accessories do. For example, at the time of me posting this video, every single brand new I-type camera that Polaroid has produced still has a baked-in, non-user replaceable battery, so I like the fact that Johnny has gone with this route. If we further remove two screws on the inside, we should be able to remove the PCB entirely from its outer casing. I'll just take the battery out there and I'll show you guys what it looks like on the rear. We have a whole bunch of different components, and as you can see, we have that removable extra terminal for the SX-70 sonar. If this is removed, this can then be adapted to shoot in an SX-70 Alpha, as I said before, but it cannot be used in a Model 1 or Model 2, like I said before, because it'll fry everything. The board is nicely laid out and should be repairable for anyone that wants to, well, you know, should anything go wrong with it in the future. Now, one other last novel feature that I'll talk about is apparently Johnny advertises this as being able to charge your phone. And I believe that what you do is if you connect your phone via a USB-C to USB-C cable, you can effectively use the built-in lithium-ion battery in this to act as a power bank in order to charge your phone, which has got to be a feature that absolutely no one asked for, but was a bonus to implement. It seems like a very strange feature to have, but I guess it's nice to have the option. I don't know how exactly useful it'll be, given that the capacity of one of these AA-sized lithium-ion batteries is only around 800 milliamp hours, and most phones have around, you know, 3,000 to 4,000 milliamp hours in their battery. So it's not exactly going to give you a full charge, but it might give you an extra few percentage of battery and get you out of a bind if you're approaching 0%. So a nice bonus feature to have, even if I don't think necessarily anyone ever asked for it. Otherwise, yeah, the actual bar itself, it's nicely constructed, it's easy to take apart, which makes it, by default, very repairable in the future, and so that means that the actual design of this thing gets a very big tick of approval from me. The fact that he's provided not only a flash pass-through, but PC sync for studio strobes, I think is a really nice addition, and that was something that that was one of the bits of feedback that I gave to Dennis when he was making his power bar. I really wanted to see him implement that, because personally I think that PC sync is probably a bit more useful than having the socket in the top, just because, as I demonstrated before, you know, the stacked flash really is very wobbly, but having a small cable come off the side doesn't put any stress or pressure on the camera and does make it very usable. So I like the fact that he's got both options in there. All right, let's talk about some of the drawbacks of such a design. Now, I feel like this is worth mentioning because whenever a flash socket design like this comes out, a lot of the average viewers are basically astonished that such a thing is possible. And I'm sure that most of you are wondering, well, why hasn't this been done sooner and why don't more people use these things? And what I don't see a lot of people talking about in their videos, and one thing that I covered in my last Ultimate Guide to I-type adapters, is that, well, there's a lot of caveats that you should be aware of when it comes to using them. And I want to demonstrate them in this video, probably in a bit more detail than I did in my last video. I would also like to point out here that this is not Johnny from PolaStudio's fault, nor is it Dennis's fault in terms of the power bar. The caveats that come from using these are simply inherent to the actual SX-70 itself. There is simply no way to power the camera through the flash socket without resulting in some of these drawbacks, and it's just a byproduct of the design itself and the concept itself, versus, say, a failing in engineering. So I think that Johnny made the best possible product out of what is inherently a flawed method of powering the camera. Now, in terms of why I think this is a bit of a flawed method of powering the camera, one of the byproducts, or one of the reasons of this, is because by its very nature, the PolaStudio mix here is not an integrated I-type adapter. Now, what do I mean by integrated I-type adapter? I mean that it has to have a manual control on or off switch. Now, I know that doesn't seem like a very big deal, but we are all human and we are all very forgetful. And although this does have power indicators that are quite bright to show you that it is in fact turned on, it would be very easily, you would be very easily able to accidentally turn this thing on, chuck it in your camera bag, and forget about it. And there is a DC to DC boost voltage circuit in here, which does require power in and of itself to convert 3.7 volts up to 6 volts. And effectively, if you were to leave this thing turned on, it would eventually drain the battery, meaning that the next time you go to use it, your battery's going to be flat and you're going to need to wait to charge it, or you're going to need to, you know, if you have a screwdriver and some spares, you could replace the battery cell. But that is an inherent drawback to this kind of design. There's just simply no way to integrate it into any of the camera's electronics. There are only two, what I would say, fully integrated battery solutions that I'm aware of. The first is the I-type adapter made by Mint. This is actually another one that I'm repairing for a client. The client actually sent this to Mint to have it I-type converted, but they didn't convert the shutter to take SX-70 film, so I'm doing that so the client can actually use it properly. But when I say that this is integrated, I mean that, you know, it basically works by simply erecting the camera and having it turn on. It has an infrared sensor in there that means that, you know, when you insert a pack of film, right, it can sense what is actually happening. And that basically means that, you know, provided you collapse the camera, this thing isn't really going to have the same issue as leaving this thing turned on. The other integrated solution, obviously, is my Polavolt battery solution, and that's because it is physically hardwired into the hinge switch that sits in the back of the camera. I effectively repurpose a pre-existing switch, route the negative lead through that, so that when the camera is collapsed, it cuts off supply to the buck converter and the batteries, meaning that it can never drain anything while the camera is in the collapsed position. Now, the other problem with powering the camera through the flash socket, I demonstrated in the last video. I'll be able to demonstrate it in a little bit better capacity here, but if we insert this, as I was just saying, there are switches inside the SX-70 that effectively control the flow of electricity. There's one in the door, so that when you open and close the door, you know, when the door is open, it is going to cut power by default. More important than that, there is a switch at the rear of the camera near the film counter, which means that should you collapse the camera, it should cut power. As you could hear, though, that's not the case with the mix. I can open the door and still fire the camera. But more alarming than that, if you leave this thing turned on and you collapse it, it's still powered. And effectively, the shutter button is being pressed against the film door right now, and it's actually focusing the lens right? I'm just squeezing those two together, right? If I squeeze that hard enough, it's actually going to fire the shutter and take a photo. And that's not going to be great for the internals of the camera, because effectively it's going to start turning gears and motor, and the film's going to jam, and when you open that camera up again, you're probably going to have to deal with, at the very best case scenario, a jammed and wasted shot of film. Worst case scenario, potentially damaging the insides of the camera, even if it may not be highly likely. And that's simply because, when you power the camera directly through the PCB and through the flash socket like that, it bypasses all the safety switches. A more integrated solution, such as Mint's battery adapter, such as my PolaVolt, or even a semi-integrated solution, such as PolaStudio's other battery adapter, which still has a manual on-off switch, you can't do that because, at the very least, the hinge switch still stays intact. There's absolutely no power going to the shutter. So this has film, and I'll just demonstrate, right? If I remove the door and collapse it, right, the shutter can't be fired, right, because the thing is collapsed. And inherently, just due to the nature of the design of this thing, that's not the case. So you absolutely have to turn it off when you're not using it, or even better, remove it from the camera. So, like I said, provided you are very, very militant at remembering to unplug it when it's not in use and turn it off, you're not going to encounter any issues. But humans are very forgetful. Personally, I like to make things as foolproof as possible. Someone actually left a great comment on my last video that I released, and they said, you can try and make things idiot-proof, but, they're just going to keep making better idiots, which I thought was very funny. But I still try and make things as foolproof as possible when I do things for clients, and this does leave some room for simple user error. Like I said, this is not Johnny's fault, nor is it Dennis's fault. This is just what happens when you power the camera through the top of the flash socket. Another big caveat to the PolaStudio Mix is that it does not work reliably with the SX-70R PCB, at least not for the sonar variants. The SX-70R PCB, for those that aren't familiar, is the manual control, Bluetooth-enabled modern reproduction PCB that effectively will soup up your camera and give it a whole bunch of extra features. I've done videos about it before. I suggest you go watch that. But this is a camera that I've converted to a client to take the SX-70R PCB, and my understanding is that the PolaStudio adapter, either the current output is too low, or the ripple of the voltage caused by the DC to DC conversion is simply too high, and it effectively causes the new PCB to wig out during autofocus. So I'm going to try and demonstrate this for you. I'm going to focus the lens using the autofocus. I'm just going to lean to the side and focus behind me. And so we can see that the camera has pre-focused. I'm now going to take a photo, but I want you to watch what happens to the lens during the photo taking. Did you see that? I'm going to do it again. And one more time. I'll try to get even closer. Let's get this thing to focus. Alright. Basically, the autofocus motor completely wigs out, and during the exposure itself, the lens completely focuses forwards. Now that will cause you to critically miss focus, because it's effectively going from infinity to all the way to 10 inches during the exposure itself. Now, if you set it to manual focus, it works fine. But what that means is if you use the PolaStudio Mix, you will be unable to use the autofocus because it's simply going to mess up a lot of your shots. You might not notice it so much if you exclusively take photos in bright scenes at around 10 inches away, but yeah, it's likely going to cause you a lot of drama. So I would only recommend using this on a sonar with a standard PCB that has been 600 modified. So unfortunately, that means that going forwards, since my business is pretty much exclusively focusing on the new SX-70R PCBs, this won't be an option that I'll really be able to recommend to my clients. Now, if you have an alpha with the new SX-70R PCB and you get the alpha variant, obviously then it's not going to be a problem, but you will need to make sure, like I said before, that it is truly an alpha with an alpha flash fire assembly. And one of the last things that I wanted to comment on was that, owning one of these mix power bars is not going to be a substitute for having a fully refurbished camera. Now, Johnny never claims such a thing. In fact, no one that's ever made these has. But I have dived into enough comment sections on Reddit and SX-70 Facebook groups to know that sometimes people see these as a kind of option where they go, oh, you can have one of these and then you don't need to have your camera modified, as if it's a way to save a lot of money. And we'll talk about cost a little bit later. But remember, as I said earlier in the video, to get the most out of this thing, you are going to want to make sure that the camera is 600 converted. And if you're going to the effort of making sure that the camera is 600 converted, it's also worthwhile refurbishing the rest of the camera too. And that's because it's super important. If you think that you can purchase one of these, slap it on your 50-year-old SX-70 that sat in Grandpa's drawer for the last 50 years, and get great results using I-type film, then, well, you might be in for a bit of a bad time. Even if you were to get an unrefurbished SX-70 sonar, such as this camera here, and use the new mix bar, it may quote-unquote work, but it may not work very well or for very long. And that's because these things are 50 years old, they came out of the factory with a lot of design flaws, and even though those design flaws got corrected in many of the later models, new problems were introduced in the form of cost reduction. And I've done video series before on just how important it is to have a fully serviced Polaroid camera, so I always get a bit hesitant to mention adapters that on the surface can appear to some people to be some kind of cost-saving solution and an alternative to having a camera serviced. And I know that's going to be a small minority of people, but it is something that I think bears mentioning. Hey guys, Jake from the future here. I just realized while I was halfway through refurbishing a client's camera that I never actually mentioned what this thing costs. This thing is going to retail for about $170 to $180 US, depending on the exact finish of the plastic housing. Which makes it about the same price as the Chromatic Parts power bar was. It makes it just under twice the cost of my PolaVault solution if I install one for you, and it makes it about $40 US cheaper than PolaStudio's other power kit that they sell. Now, personally, if it was up to me, I would opt for their other power kit over the mix, purely because I think it's a better product with a better power supply and much less caveats to using it. Because it's only, $40 US more. It's already a lot of money that you're spending on upgrading the camera. Personally, I think it's a better choice, and it also adds strap lugs. So for example, if you were to add one to a Model 1 or a Model 2 bodied camera, it does gain some extra functionality. So make of that what you will. So I think it's safe to say that, I think that the PolaStudio Mix is a nice product, although it is certainly a niche product. I think for a very small number of individuals, it'll be something that they, seek out, because there are a small percentage of people that have an SX-70 that is already 600 converted, that they don't want to further cosmetically modify, that is either a sonar or an alpha, and the 600 conversion has been done without using a modern PCB replacement, that may want to use this provided that they follow the directions to the T. Because yeah, there is certainly a small demographic of SX-70 shooters that want to use I-type but absolutely refuse to cosmetically alter the camera. And whether or not this is, a correct point of view or not is entirely subjective. I do know that many people view the SX-70 as an objet d'art, and, you know, think that any kind of modification to it is sacrilege. I know that there are some people out there that will see this green SX-70 as sacrilege because it dares to deviate from the original color scheme. And who am I to say what someone's taste is? The only thing that I would say, and add to it though, is personally, as a repairman, I don't necessarily see the point of obsessing over the camera's cosmetics. Because if you're going to truly care for an SX-70, you know, the thing has to be stored flat, right? So in terms of modifying the cosmetics, the only benefit that I can think of is for times where you are taking photos of the camera instead of taking photos with the camera. Because, like I said, you do really need to store these things flat. Although they are lovely to look at when they're nice and erect. Wow, phrasing. Yeah, although it's nice to look at while erect, you shouldn't leave it erect for too long. Wow, phrasing. I guess what I'm trying to say is, when you leave an SX-70 in the erect position, it invites dust inside the viewfinder, Fresnel screen, and optical assembly. If there is power going through any of the circuits, it puts stress on the microchips, and UV light causes the rubber in the bellows to shrink. So when you do leave cameras on display to look at them, you are shortening the lifespan of the camera when you do it. Thus, the camera should be stored in the collapsed position, and in the case of the mix bar, you should store it off the camera anyway. Meaning that, does it really matter, like, cosmetically what it looks like, given that you're really not meant to have them erect to fully appreciate them anyway? It kind of means that the only time that anyone's really going to notice or care is in a photo of the camera. And I mean, if you take a photo of the camera from the front, even with most I-type mods, there's really no way that you can tell. I mean, let's look at my PolaVault mod, you know? If you take a photo of the camera from basically any angle, you know, you can't really see the I-type adapter. If you were in a group shot, you can kind of cover it with your hand. And other I-type adapters are the same. I mean, I would say that Mintz is arguably one of the cleanest full-body replacement I-type adapters. And again, sort of from the front view, or if you're taking photos of it, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't alter the appearance all that much. So I never personally, you know, understood the whole obsession with wanting it to be as unmodified as possible. I mean, I guess sleeper culture exists, where people want things to be souped up and modified, but, you know, don't necessarily want it to look modified. But again, I prioritize something being practical and usable over simply aesthetics. And I think if you compare most traditional I-type adapters, even add-on ones such as the Reservoir adapter, which was the first commercially available I-type adapter, there are far less drawbacks to using either a traditional pogo pin design or something integrated like my PolaVault than there are to using one of these. This really is only going to appeal to a very small subset of people, and if you're in that group of people, that's awesome. I'm glad that you have a product that suits your need. So there we have it. I would love to know what your opinions are on the Power Mix in the comments below. I think it's a great product for what is ultimately somewhat of a flawed way in terms of powering the camera, but I think it makes the best out of a bad scenario, and I think Johnny has really done as good a job as anyone can do in order to make this thing. I'd love to know your thoughts, and as always, like, subscribe, feel free to leave me a donation or send me something to be repaired, and I will see you in the next video. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.